we are. And what time is it? 91. So probably we should start and then we'll just let people in. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first Australian webinar. We are really excited to have this morning Christy Rosie with us. I'm Alex Alvarado, a biomedical engineer at Control Bionics. I've been in the company for 2 years now, so yeah, really excited about this webinar. And why don't we, Ricardo, just introduce yourself? So Ricardo is our regional consultant for Queensland, and then yeah.
Hey everyone, thank you all for being here, and thanks Alex. Yes, my name is Ricardo. I have been in the company for almost a year now. I'm Control Bionics biomedical engineer, and I look after Queensland. I'm based in Brisbane, and I usually go to the Gold Coast probably once a week. So you may say that those two cities are the main ones that I visit, but of course I look after the whole state of Queensland here in Australia.
Yeah, and we'll share our contact details at the end of the presentation. So yeah, so Christy, why didn't you just present yourself? And I think that can you all see guys screen just where the presentation is? Yeah. Okay, good, perfect.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Christy Rousey. I am a U.S. sales consultant for Control Bionics. I am in the Northeast area. More specifically, I'm located a little bit closer to New York. I am a speech-language pathologist, and I've been with Control Bionics in the U.S. for a little over a year now. So what I am going to be presenting on today is talking a lot about implementing alternative access techniques for individuals who present with complex bodies. So really excited that you guys were able to join me this morning. I love that I get to kind of interact with people from across the globe, especially in my position. Going to Australia is honestly on my bucket list, so hearing you guys talk about all the different areas, it's really exciting. So I'm hoping after, hopefully all this COVID and everything settles down, I'll be able to make a trip out there soon. At the end of the PowerPoint, I do have resources, I have a reference list, and then I also have my personal email. So if you have any specific questions, you can reach out to me after the presentation, more one-on-one, and you should be receiving a copy of the recording as well as a handout of the presentation whenever we are finished. You are automatically muted with your camera turned off, so if you do have a question during the presentation, you can use the chat feature of Zoom, and Ricardo and Alex are going to kind of act as moderators for me and kind of let me know towards the end if there is a specific question or comment. So a little overview, let's see here. There we go, of kind of what we're going to cover in today's webinar. So I'll review a couple of alternative access options for communication, techniques for introducing these alternative access options, what impacts these individuals have on learning, and then talking about a couple of multimodal options and what the research is saying in that area. So when we look at these individuals with complex bodies, they present with physical access challenges in addition to communication difficulties. So they're going to need a variety of adaptive equipment to be able to communicate and access their environment across their lifetime. Traditionally, they're going to present with either high tone, low tone, or it could fluctuate throughout the day, and that is partly what impacts their ability to access their communication and other things in their environment. They also present with limited fine motor skills and control to be able to direct select on their communication system. And from birth, we find that they experience limited opportunities to be able to manipulate and really explore in their environment, which is going to impact how they learn. When I use this term to talk about individuals with complex bodies, I'm talking about those who are going to be diagnosed with conditions such as cerebral palsy, TBI, stroke, ALS or MND, and muscular dystrophy. For this webinar specifically, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth with the pediatric population. So going to be talking a little bit more about those who maybe have cerebral palsy, TBI, or muscular dystrophy, SMA. So when we look at impacts for these diagnoses, we have to focus on so much more than just the physical aspect. The physical could impact their communication, which then could impact their cognition and also influence their emotional status. So we kind of have to look at everything as a whole and keep in mind that it's really hard to separate these components when kind of trying to find what is that perfect access technique for them. So how do these individuals struggle with access? So as I mentioned, they do present with motor challenges, but they're also going to present with sensory and processing challenges, which is going to impact how they're able to successfully utilize their communication system. Movement for these individuals can be difficult to initiate and coordinate, and we're asking them to initiate and coordinate movement in order to be successful for communication. So automatically that's going to be a little challenging for them. A lot of times they demonstrate frequent status changes throughout the day, and that can be anything ranging from their position, their tone, medication, which is going to impact their ability to consistently utilize those motor movements. And then they also present with fatigue, which can be viewed as physical and cognitive. When we look at barriers to communication, again, I have physical access at the top. That's kind of what we're going to be focusing on a lot in this presentation. But again, when we look at everything that impacts how they're able to communicate, it's so much more than that and just language comprehension and expression. We have to look at their cognitive ability, how are they positioned, their attitudes, potential lack of motivation, cognitive and physical fatigue factor, and also learned helplessness, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later in the webinar. So we have to look at these different components that affect success with AAC and communication, and we have to realize that these are not necessarily linear. Physical access or reduced physical access could impact their emotional state. It can impact their ability to communicate, which in turn can impact their language, and then it affects their communication partner. So it's kind of important to keep in mind that this is a continuum that we always need to be constantly assessing and taking note of. So who is going to be involved with making these access decisions for these clients specifically? We want to look at it as a team approach. So the OT and the PT are going to be instrumental in assessing their seating and positioning in order that they can access their alternative access as best as possible. The speech language pathologist is obviously going to be involved in evaluating their language abilities, cognition status, what is motivating to them, their communication software, the best layout. A physician could be involved as well because they are going to be managing some surgical and pharmacological aspects of the movement disorders. The client's family, and then the individual themselves, which honestly should be at the top of this list because they are the most important individual in this whole aspect and really should be guiding our decision-making process the entire time. So when we look at using alternative access for communication, the goal is that we're going to want them to learn a new motor skill that's going to engage their working memory until that movement becomes automatic. So if we're introducing a new movement or motor plan, we want to be actively engaging that working memory so we can build new neuronal connections and kind of pathways. If we pick a movement that's already kind of automatic, then it's going to be difficult for them to really increase that cognitive component that is needed for learning a new skill. So we take that motor movement and then we're going to combine it with all of those other aspects that make AAC use successful, such as the sensory components, the cognitive load, language, linguistic skills, motor components, and social components. What I'll go ahead and review are different alternative access options. The first one we're going to talk about is head tracking. So with head tracking, the user can use a head mouse or a laser pointer. A head mouse is going to be a reflective marker that's traditionally placed on their forehead, glasses, or hat, and it uses an infrared technology that uses head movement to control the cursor on the screen. A lower tech option is a laser pointer, in which a laser light or is a pointer is attached on the side of their head, and they use that to point to letters on a communication board or words in order to communicate. It's best suited for users who have adequate range of motion, neck motion, that range of motion that is, so that they can move the pointer around to different aspects on the screen. And there is a little bit of not as much research on the use of this with the pediatric population as with some other access techniques. So here's a quick little video of using head tracking with a laser pointer for someone who is in an acute care. So you see there, she has the laser light attached to her glasses, and she's looking around at different words on the communication board that's placed on the wall in front of her.
Please adjust my arm. Okay. Lay it down. Over this way. Okay. Okay. Great.
So the next alternative access technique that we're going to look at and honestly spend most of the webinar talking about are switches. So switches are devices that can trigger an action from emitting an electrical signal. Traditionally, it's used to select an icon on a speech-generating device via a scanning method. It's utilized by individuals who cannot directly access the screen of their system. Switches come in a variety of sizes, shapes, types, colors. Honestly, there's so many variety with them now. They can be activated by a wide range of movements, so large movements, small movements. We have proximity sensors and switches, and traditionally they're mounted to the user's wheelchair or placed on a tray. So kind of another component that we want to keep in mind whenever we're talking about introducing switches. More traditional switches are going to have to be mounted and attached so that the user can easily access them and it's constantly in their environment. We have two types of switches. One type is a mechanical, and that is your traditional jelly beans, Big Mac switches, things like that. And what we do with mechanical switches, the user has to physically depress the button or a surface in order to cause activation. Then on the other hand, we have electronic switches, and electronic switches don't require pressure or force for the user to activate. So those are going to be more your proximity switches, candy corns, things like that. So if we look at comparing mechanical versus electronic switches and kind of weigh the pros and cons, with a mechanical switch, the user has to visually locate, touch, press, hold, and then release the switch in order to activate or kind of initiate one movement or make one selection. For these users, it might require a lot of adrenaline in order to initiate the motor plan and utilize enough force to make that activation. It does require graded movement, and we know that graded movement can be difficult for those who have complex bodies. They can struggle to release the actual switch, so maybe they can get to that location really well, but they have a hard time physically depressing their hand and taking force off in order to make that activation. Mechanical switches also provide auditory and provide really good tactile feedback, so can be good to use whenever we're working with someone who we want to look at just cause and effect and just starting to introduce these types of switches to them. Electronic, on the other hand, requires zero force to activate, and usually it's less movement as well. Once the user gets their body into that a location that the proximity or the sensor switch is able to locate, then that's how they activate. And one difficulty that we do see is that we have difficulty deciphering intentional versus unintentional hits, whereas with a mechanical switch, the user can be physically reaching and pushing down on a button, so that might appear a little bit more intentional activation versus using some proximity switches. Common difficulties that we see when we use switches are that our users may not be able to reliably reach a fixed target in space. So they could struggle as the day goes on, consistently reaching the target that they're looking for. They can fatigue just from physically accessing the switch. In individuals who use switches in the same switch site for years at a time, we do see that they have a recurrent or can incur an overuse injury with that switch site area from the force and adrenaline required to activate. Their body may fatigue so that maintaining the same level of force throughout the day is a challenge for them. And it also can be impacted by how they change positions throughout the day. If the individual moves positions from the wheelchair to the bed, then the switch kind of has to come with it. Also could be impacted by different caregivers that are coming kind of in and out of the home or the school environment. So when we look at introducing switches, where you can look at the motor cognitive learning principles. So how do these younger individuals with complex body really learn new motor movements? So we can look at and say that intent drives their movement. We want them to be an active participant in their environment. So we need to create an environment in which we can influence intrinsic motivation and give them the want and the need to really explore their environment and figure things out. Provide them opportunities for learning so that they can experience success with their motor movement and kind of realize that their body can affect their environment, which in turn can provide more motivation, more attention, and more intention. We want to provide hundreds and thousands of repetitions with small modifications to help them progress through the motor learning and also not get bored and engage that working memory. And we want to provide clear and appropriate feedback. So learned helplessness is something that some of these individuals do experience because it's an outcome of maybe not having control over your environment. So as these individuals go throughout childhood, a lot of times they're bathed, they're dressed, they're fed, and they don't really get to learn how their body is able to directly control and kind of affect their life. So they experience continuous failures when trying to manipulate and play in the world, and they can become frustrated and just view themselves as a passive participant. So what we want to do is modify the environment so they can become engaged learners. Steps to overcome, Linda Burkhart described this in a presentation that is linked at the bottom of the webinar, is that we want to provide intrinsic motivation, allow them to become an active participant in their environment. When they're learning these new motor skills, provide them with multiple modalities such as auditory feedback, tactile feedback, visual feedback to really engage all of their senses, and then present it to them in naturalistic context so they can kind of see the connection as really how they can affect change in their own life. So when we introduce switches, we want to look at more than just what is the physical aspect of the activity, what is the cognitive, psychosocial, linguistic and language component that we're wanting to address with the switch. You can attempt multiple placement sites in order to find the best one that kind of works for the individual. Fall back on those principles of motor learning. We want them to be a problem solver, utilize that cognitive involvement, and then give them multiple repetitions in order to influence success. And taking a hands-off approach, is really important. I know I do this a lot. We put our hands on the user, provide hand-over-hand feedback to kind of show them and model what we want them to do. But for these learners, we really want them to be able to kind of create and learn these motor plans on their own, so that they can really realize and not become prompt dependent on someone touching them in order to initiate the movement. Once they're able to activate the switch, we want to provide quick, immediate feedback with short effects so that they can learn and take on that cause and effect of touching the switch and the reaction that they get from it. And one other thing that we can do is consult with PT and OT to review the positioning. Karen Kangas wrote an article that's also linked at the bottom talking about pelvic stability and pelvic weight bearing in order to influence task performance. So we want the pelvis to be in more of an active holding position versus passively restricted. So also another aspect we can look at is kind of the coordination of learning when these individuals are learning so many new skills in order to be successful with AAC. So developing new motor patterns takes cognitive awareness, and it utilizes that working memory until we have automatic movement that can be established. If we decide to combine all those skills that are used for AAC at once, such as the motor component, cognitive components, linguistic and sensory components, it could be too challenging for the user. So something that we can do to kind of scaffold the activity is concentrate on the new skills that we would like to present while pairing it with maybe automatic abilities that are already in their repertoire to kind of remove that burden from their working memory and try to increase the chance of success and carryover. So for an example would be, if we wanted to target a new motor movement for switch access, pair it with maybe an activity that's not directly tied to language, something that's motivating like singing songs or providing them something that gives them immediate feedback. On the flip side, introducing non-electronic communication such as paper-based communication that maybe is going to match what is in their electronic AAC systems so they can learn via partner-assisted scanning or just looking at it visually to take on the language concepts, and removing that access component could also be another example of that as well. So something that we also don't want to do is look at how we're prompting and providing feedback to these individuals. We don't necessarily want them to become dependent on the prompt. So like I said, dependent upon the hand over hand, dependent upon the verbal prompt to initiate the movement. Something that's really important is modeling the activity versus just giving them verbal instruction. When we look at AAC for our direct access users, they talk a lot about being a good model, modeling the language on the AAC system, and the same rings true for those individuals who are using alternative access. We want them to see peers and instructors using their system as well, so that it can provide more opportunities for them to view it and kind of model that activity and imitate the activity. We want to provide clear and concise feedback on what we want them to do, but also how they responded with the activity. Take a hands-off approach, so not as much hand over hand, and then pause again, and then if you think you've paused too long, pause some more. A lot of these individuals have processing deficits, not only with the cognitive component, but with the motor component, as I mentioned before. So we really want to give them enough time to initiate the motor movement and kind of make those motor and cognitive connections. So the SET framework was designed by Joy Zabala, and what she did was kind of create a set of questions that you can use to kind of guide how you select appropriate tools for your students. It's a set of questions that you follow through looking at the student themselves. So what is difficult for them to achieve? What are their interests, abilities, and what overall concerns do we have? Looking at the supports that the student and the staff has, the different materials in their environment, the equipment that they have access to, what's the actual access issue with the student, and then what are the attitudes and expectations of kind of everyone involved, not just the student, not necessarily just the family, but the staff as well. Then you ask the questions about the tasks. So what are the tasks that we want the child to be able to do? And then what are the tasks that are already in their natural environment that we can utilize to kind of influence progress? And then from kind of going through those questions, we can decide what tools are needed to address the student, brainstorm some ideas, and then select for trials and organize specifics to collect data. So I think it's important to look at fatigue that is seen with AAC systems. In this webinar specifically, I talk a lot about the physical fatigue factor that these individuals experience in trying to access switches, but they also have a cognitive fatigue factor as well, and it can be really hard to separate or distinguish between the two. We could be seeing signs that present as physical fatigue because they're not necessarily initiating that motor movement, their reaction time is low, but it could also be attributed to a cognitive fatigue aspect as well. So what are our steps to success? Lead let the client lead. So what is the activity that we're trying to target, and then how can we modify that activity to create a feeling of competence and give them multiple chances for success, and then provide multiple repetitions of that activity. We don't want the user to get bored or just kind of use the switch to request the same thing, because then over time, like I said, we're not really engaging a new cognitive task, and we want to really continuously guide them as we slowly scaffold and increase the difficulty to compare that and merge it with their AAC system. So this is a fun little video. I'm not sure if you guys in Australia are aware of Stella, but Stella is a dog whose mother is a speech language pathologist in the US, and she taught her dog to utilize an AAC communication board. These are all just single hit switches with a single word on them, and she utilized all the same techniques that we say that we want to utilize with our clients to make them successful AAC users. This video was posted about a year ago, and the mother is using wait time in order to encourage Stella to combine words to make requests. If you're not familiar, this is the Instagram handle. There's all kinds of words, and Stella operates a board much larger than this at this point in time.
Okay, I hear you. Let's go.
It's amazing if you go to the Instagram account. Stella can say how she's feeling, request for help, and she combines words. I think she's up to 3-word phrases now, maybe even some 4, which is pretty amazing to see. So certain things to consider when we're looking at single switch scanning. So like I mentioned before, a lot of the users are going to utilize their switch to activate something on their communication device via a scanning method, and that can either be single switch scanning or 2-switch scanning. So when we look at single switch scanning, it does kind of place demands on the physical, cognitive, sensory, and perceptual components of the user. If we look at the cognitive and physical load that it places, the individual has to really pay attention to the timing of their movements. They have to have enough attention and concentration to know when to initiate the motor pattern to make that selection that they want. We can modify scanning parameters to increase the success, such as the speed, the direction, pattern, and feedback, such as providing them with auditory and visual cues. So here's an example. This is my colleague Jill utilizing a frequency scanning keyboard and with our neuro node, and this is single switch row column scanning.
Go. Out.
If we look at 2-switch step scanning, this is a little different in that the user is presented with 2 switches and they themselves are in control of the actual scan. So it's not dependent upon timing, weighting, or any rhythm. Traditionally, the individual is going to use 2 separate switch sites or 2 separate motor movements. One switch is going to be used to progress or step, with the other one being used to activate. It can be difficult if the user presents with only one really viable potential access site, and it can still cause fatigue because they are utilizing multiple movements throughout the course of the day. So here's an example of myself. I'm actually going to be demonstrating how we can kind of mimic a 2-switch scan with one neuronode. So I'm using the same movement, which is finger flexion, but instead of one quick movement, it's going to be my progress movement, and I'm going to hold my finger as my selection movement. But it's a good example of just how the user can control the speed of the scan themselves. So if I open up my communication application, as I move my finger, it's going to change which row it highlights. When I want to make a selection, I'll just hold my finger up to indicate that that is the selection that I want to make.
Like. This. I like this.
So it's a little bit different than your traditional 2-switch step scan in the sense that I'm not utilizing 2 separate switches, but I am controlling the speed at which it. Open up my computer. So if I open it. All right. So that takes me to talking a little bit more about our neuronode, which is the switch that we have created. The neuronode is an SEMG and spatial sensor. It's completely wearable, wireless, and connected to the individual's communication device via Bluetooth. So a little bit about the neuronode itself. It has a 24-hour active battery life. It's completely wearable and attachable to the user. So it moves with them as they move to different positions throughout the day. Small and compact. We utilize spatial and EMG technology to pick up single muscle movements and create switch sites from those movements. It's durable and it's iOS and Windows compatible. So when we look at the neuronode specifically for individuals with complex bodies, we'll look at those same kind of difficulties that I explained a little bit earlier in the webinar, and how the neuronode can kind of combat or work to decrease these difficulties. So the first one is able to reach a fixed target in space. The neuronode's attachable to the user, and it registers a single body movement. So for instance, the user doesn't necessarily have to always reach the same target in space. They're just making a movement, and it doesn't necessarily matter exactly where their body is located. Maintain same level of force is what you see with some mechanical switches. The neuronode doesn't require force to activate, and the amount of movement that is needed is completely customized to the user's current status. So if their fatigue level or status changes throughout the day, then the amount of movement that is required is also going to be customized and changed throughout the day. If the client needs to change positions, and traditional switches would need to be moved around to accommodate that, the neuronode is already on the body of the user, therefore we don't really need to make any other modifications and kind of move it around with them. With the recurrent overuse injuries that we see with switches that require a lot of force for individuals that have been using them for multiple years, because the neuronode doesn't require pressure and we can really pick up on really small minimal movements, it's not really going to cause as much overuse injuries as what we might see with traditional switches. And then the fatigue from accessing the switch, I think this is something that's really unique, being that it's wearable. A lot of switches are going to catch the end of the motor pattern. So if the user is able to reach for the switch with their hand, but maybe they initiate that motor movement in their shoulder, we're kind of catching that end of the motor plan with a traditional switch, where in this instance, the neuronode can be placed just on the shoulder, and we can adjust the settings to kind of pick up the user as they go to initiate, making them a little bit more efficient and hopefully reducing fatigue. So the first aspect we're going to look at with the neuronode is the use of EMG switching. So EMG is electromyography, or the electrical activity associated with the activation of a muscle group. It's detected by non-invasive electrodes on the skin, and the user's EMG signal is displayed as a graph on our controller application. We can modify the threshold parameters based upon that individual user's fatigue level. So in order to create a switch, we kind of have some techniques that differentiate from registering what would be an intentional movement versus an unintentional movement. One of those is having two thresholds in order to create a switch. So we have our signal on, which is the level of activity that the EMG signal needs to cross in order to be counted as a switch. And then we have our signal off, and that's the threshold in which the user's EMG signal has to get below or really back down to rest in order for them to make a second switch. So really having the second signal offline kind of differentiates us from just a traditional switch that might be one movement or signal on, signal off. But then also we can filter out a lot of fasciculations or high tone that could be caused as unintentional movements or unintentional hits on other systems. So here's an example of using EMG switching on myself. The video has no sound. I'm using finger flexion. So the neuronode is placed right on my forearm to register that muscle as it moves and contracts with my finger. And I am connected to the predictable communication app using single switch scanning. So I just flex my finger when I want to make my selection. And if you had a user who had this type of movement, we could detect even smaller movements than what I am demonstrating here. So here's kind of what the controller application looks like with our EMG and the graph. So here's an example of a really good EMG peak. This is kind of what we want to see. The blue line represents the EMG activity. So as you go and contract your muscle, you'll see changes on the graph. Once that EMG signal crosses that green line or the signal on threshold, that is the point at which the user is going to be making their switch. In order for them to make a switch again, it has to get back down below this yellow line. If we look at this example, this is a little bit more like what the EMG signal or graph we might see with some of our users. Not necessarily a really clean peak when they go to initiate their movement. In this example, this is one movement, but you see the EMG signal cross the line multiple times. However, because the signal did not get back down below the yellow, it was still only counted as one switch. Another option that I think is really unique within our controller application is the dynamic scaling mode. And what this does is it automatically adjusts those signal on and signal off thresholds based upon the user's performance. So if the neuronode controller application notices that the resting level is coming down, or maybe that their EMG signal isn't as high as it was at the beginning of the day, those threshold values will automatically adjust and begin to lower so that it can accommodate for that change. So here's an example of the controller application in dynamic scaling. You'll see the thresholds are not two solid lines, but they kind of descend down. And then there's a slight uptick right here as my EMG signal was really high, and it's accounting for those higher EMG peaks. The second option that we have is our spatial switching option, which I actually use a lot with the pediatric population specifically because I think it is really unique. So what spatial does is instead of reading a muscle contraction like with EMG, it's going to just read a movement. So we want to place the neuronode on a part of the body that registers voluntary movement. It's going to be placed at the point of maximal deflection, and then the movement is going to be captured by our sensors and processed to create a graph of activity. So the spatial graph is going to look just like our EMG graph. We still have our signal on and signal off thresholds. The blue line is going to be representing our movement. Another thing that I think is really unique about spatial is that it's going to look at movement on our 3 different movement planes, so side to side, front and back, up and down. The goal of using spatial is to kind of figure out what's the movement plane that we really want to target with our user. That is the movement, that is the area or plane of movement that they're going to move in order to make their switch. And then we're going to turn off the reading of the other 2 planes so that if the user moves in that plane specifically, it's not necessarily going to set their system off. So another way that we can kind of filter out unintentional movement that should not be counted as a switch. So here's an example of using toe tap in spatial mode. I like this video because you can see the controller application in the background and really how much limited movement is needed to create a switch. So when you hear the auditory feedback or the beep, that is just signifying that her movement was enough to make the selection. You'll see there's differences on the graph between when she was resting or not moving her foot. The lines were down here. As she went and initiated the movement, we had some nice clean peaks that kind of moved with the movement of her foot. Another really great thing about spatial, as you see here, it doesn't have to be directly on the skin. So it's just wrapped around the shoe and detecting movement. So really good for maybe some of our children who present with tactile defensiveness or some sensory challenges. This is an amazing video here, probably one of our younger users. She is kind of just in that exploratory phase, cause and effect, but I love this example because her mom utilizes all of those really good techniques that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. Hands-off approach, she's kind of just letting her figure out the motor movement that she needs to do, providing her good, clear feedback, and also giving her some wait time here. And she has the neuronode in spatial.
Clever girl! You did that, darling. Clever girl. More? Pull your arm back. Oh, good trying. Try again. Yay! Clever girl. More? Twist that wrist. Whoa.
So I think this video is a great example of how we can take something that's as high tech as the neuronode and kind of decrease the demands a little bit to where she's just learning cause and effect and learning how she can be kind of an active participant in her environment through her motor movements. So talking a little bit about the graph specifically on the neuronode, you heard the auditory feedback in those videos, but it does provide auditory and visual feedback when the user creates enough movement that we've selected to be a switch. So we kind of employ a neuromuscular retraining aspect with the visual and auditory feedback, but as well as having the graphs that they can really see how much movement is needed in order to create their switch. So we really can completely customize the movement that is needed according to their ability. And even I say with some of my initial users, even if they're adults, just taking the first day or 2 days to really work within the controller application so that they can kind of get that motor pattern down with how much movement do I need versus how much movement maybe do I want in order to make my selection. So if we look at EMG and spatial, here's kind of a comparison of what clients are good with what type of reading. So EMG is really good if the user presents with minimal movement because we can pick up on really small muscle changes, even changes that are naked to the visible eye, and create a switch access site from that. EMG can be really good if the user fatigues easily, if they only have facial movement, because we can elicit movement like an eyebrow raise or a smile to create a switch site. And EMG is also good if they have a consistent activation of a single muscle. Spatial activation can be really good for a user who maybe has a variable EMG signal, so lots of high tone or lots of fasciculations throughout the day because it's just reading a movement, not necessarily a muscle contraction. Spatial can be good if we have a lot of tactile defensiveness, because it doesn't have to be on the skin. If they present with fasciculations or tremors, we can essentially turn off the reading in the movement plane where they tremor. And if they move in a movement plane opposite of the tremor, then that can be counted as a switch. And then also for good head control, I actually have a couple of clients in the US who are using spatial on the head to mimic head switching for these individuals who struggled with traditional head switches because of the fatigue factor or reduced range of motion. So moving on to another alternative access method, which is Eyegaze. Eyegaze probably has been kind of more a hot topic the last 10 years, and we've seen a lot of progress with Eyegaze technology, and it's moving in a really exciting direction. So Eyegaze uses an infrared light source that reflects off the cornea in order to track eye movements. Traditionally, the user is going to use dwell or blink in order to activate, but they can also activate by using a switch. Using dwell requires precise motor control, and we want the users to have stable head position so they have the most success. The user needs to have control over their eye movements, but Eyegaze and success with Eyegaze can be impacted by so much, including fatigue, their medication, the user's positioning, droopy lids, and certain lighting conditions, such as if they're in direct sunlight or maybe have a lot of natural light in the room. So here's an example of using Eyegaze in a high-tech mode. She is still using our neuro node to activate, but if you notice, she looks at the different letters and it highlights where she's looking with her eyes.
My leg.
So now moving on to some options for multimodal access. So this is kind of a new option really in the AAC market now. So traditionally, individuals with complex bodies utilize a single access method, but it can incur some problems, and that can include an inefficiency, fatigue, not optimal setup, their specific positioning, and status changes throughout the day. So in this context, multimodal just means providing them with more than one physical access method, which can provide them flexibility of access based upon their condition. There's a couple of researchers in the US that are starting to do a little bit more research on multimodal access. One of them is Dr. Susan Fager, and she suggested that giving the users an additional access method may allow them to have success with certain access techniques like Eyegaze, for which they were not ideal candidates for solely in a case study that she did. So essentially giving someone who maybe wasn't the best candidate for Eyegaze solely, but providing them with a switch to activate could potentially increase their accuracy and success with that method. So a little bit about the benefits with multimodal communication. Eyegaze access alone can be challenging because of dry eyes, fatigue, positioning, and lighting conditions. Scanning can be slow, fatiguing, laborious. We see overuse injuries for individuals who use the same switch site for years at a time. So with multimodal benefits, we can kind of combine the best of both worlds for each access method to provide the user with faster speed, increased accuracy, and less fatigue. And certain switching techniques like the neuronode can detect minimal movements. So we can really increase their efficiency and also accuracy. So we do have a multimodal communication system, and that is our NeuroNode Trilogy. So the NeuroNode Trilogy combines Eyegaze with the NeuroNode technology, so you get 3 access methods in one system. So the Trilogy acts like any other Eyegaze system. You can use dwell or blink as your activation, but then in addition to that, you also get the option of using switch scanning with the NeuroNode and the Trilogy combination, which is the most unique to us, that combines Eyegaze plus switch activation, which is our NeuroNode. So here's an example of using Eyegaze with the NeuroNode in the EMG mode. So Maddie has electrodes on her cheek, and it's going to register every time she smiles. That's going to be her selection. So she's going to look around at the screen in order to select the icon, to locate the icon she wants to select. And then when she wants to make her selection, she's going to smile to activate.
Hi. How are you doing? What have you been up to? Good to see you. When will I see you again? Goodbye.
So here's an example of using Eyegaze with the neuronode in spatial mode. The neuronode is placed on Sarah's wrist, and she is just going to do a little lateral movement to activate.
I want you to look at this. I want you to look at this.
So as you see, with this access method, the icon is not going to activate until the user intentionally makes a movement. So more specifically with our adults who use the trilogy, some of the feedback that we've been getting is that they really like this option for access because it helps their accuracy, because they feel like they have a little bit more control in controlling the activations. As with traditional dwell using an Eyegaze system, especially when the user starts to learn their communication boards, they could be looking around just kind of trying to visually locate the icon that they want and accidentally start activating letters. So already they have to go and clear, and it kind of sets them behind. Whereas this, even if they're not necessarily looking at the right target, they can kind of shift their attention or shift their eye gaze to locate the right target and then make the movement to select. So this is a really interesting research study. It was a poster presentation at ASHA, which is the American Speech and Hearing Association conference in the United States. It was in Florida this year. And so what this case study looked at is they looked at utilizing multimodal access with 2 adults with cerebral palsy. So they combined Eyegaze with switch scanning. It's a novel activation method, so not exactly with the type of system that we present. The 2 individuals were looking at a visual scene display, and then they would look at the general area of the screen and then make their selection, and then it would start individually highlighting the different options, and they would hit a switch to activate. So truly combining the Eyegaze and the switch scanning principle of utilizing Eyegaze plus switch. But the results were really interesting. So for the first participant, they demonstrated the fastest accuracy with Eyegaze and the slowest with scanning. But when we look at her, the fastest selection. But when we look at the percentage of accuracy for selecting the target, the multimodal was the most accurate at 100%, which I think is really interesting. The second participant, their fastest method was scanning, and their slowest was the multimodal. And if you look at the time differences, there is a significant time difference between the 2 participants as well. But same thing, the percentage of accuracy of selecting the target, multimodal kind of tied with scanning at 75%, and Eyegaze was the least accurate. So when we look at accuracy with these case studies, we see that multimodal access for both of these individuals was the most accurate for them. And ultimately, that's one of the main principles that we want to find, is that our users can have increased accuracy with communication so that they can demonstrate reduced frustration. So here's all of my wonderful references that I kind of pulled together to utilize to create this webinar. Here is a nice little resource list. The RERC is the facility out of Penn State specifically that did that poster presentation in case study. So that is a link to their website as well as this poster presentation, and a couple of other little handouts and things here that you guys can have access to. This was for earlier today, but if you guys want to do all things Control Bionics today, we had a little tech talk earlier on our Facebook page with our Grid 3 partner. Grid 3 is the communication software that we utilize on our Trilogy system. So we got a lot of really great information on that software. If you're interested, you can jump over there. And here is my contact information with my email. So if you have any specific questions about what you saw on the webinar, or just want to give me some really good travel recommendations when I go visit Australia, that's great too. Feel free to contact me. And then this is it for me, but if Alex and Ricardo, if you guys want to jump on and give your contact information for the participants as well.
Yeah, sure. But just before that, Christy, we have a question from Rob saying,
Okay.
what's your experience introducing switches with orthotoid CP? Have you dealt with drug impact on users? My user is just going on to baclofen.
Oh, okay. Well, my background has been, before I worked with Control Bionics, I worked primarily in pediatric, working with a lot of kids with cerebral palsy. And I would say that working, that is probably one of the most challenging populations to work with, and really finding access, because we know that their tone can kind of fluctuate and change throughout the day. So I almost say for those individuals, it really kind of depends on the user. If we're talking more or less like using the neuronodes specifically, it's interesting because sometimes with some of these users, I would think that would want to use spatial because I don't want to tap into the EMG if it affects their tone. But I have had a lot of success with utilizing EMG, maybe on a placement site that they don't have a lot of control over, because we can tap into such minimal movement. But on the flip side, the example that I gave, I did work with a young child who had cerebral palsy, trialed 2-switch scanning and fatigued a lot with that, because the switches were utilized. He was touching it with his hand, and he was the one that kind of initiated that motor movement from his shoulder. So we were actually able to put the neuro node on his shoulder, but his opposite from his dominant arm, and we elicited really small movements that he was still moving this arm, but it didn't really matter because we were detecting movement on the neuro node that was less movement, and we had less missed hits, if that kind of makes sense. So.
Right. Okay. Thanks. So yeah, actually, what I'll do, I'm just gonna share our contact details. So I'm just gonna stop for a moment, Christy.
Yeah, sure. Do you want me to stop share?
Yes, please. Here we are. Yep, good. And then yep, so this is our contact details for both Ricardo, who is our regional representative in Queensland, and myself, that I'm based in Melbourne, Victoria. So yeah, feel free to send us an email if you have like any questions, or if you wanna do an assessment. So we do free assessments with our technology, where we take the gear with your clients, and we try like the different access methods that we've got available. So I don't know if there are any more questions from our attendees. Let me just have a look into the chat. Let me just stop sharing this for a sec. So any questions, guys, in here, or is it all good?
I think that was the only question in the chat, so I think you're good.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very, very much, Christy. It's been really, really good to have like all this information in here. And Ricardo, I don't know if you've got anything else to add.
Same here. Just thanking you a lot, Christy. Great presentation. Thank you very much for all this information, and thank you everybody for joining us today as well.
Happy Friday.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.